So when I graduated from college, my mother said, look at this Elisabeth Freeman scrapbook. Elisabeth Freeman was my mother's aunt, my great aunt, and my mother was her favorite niece, and that's how we got the scrapbook. And the scrapbook was created by her mother, about Elizabeth's mother, Mary Freeman. And she would go on these long speaking engagements and across country and so forth and send back clippings. And her mother kept up this scrapbook. It's just chock full of information about all the causes that she was involved in. And it inspired me to do more research, and I did several jaunts to archives, and then eventually to do an exhibit at the Cooperative Gallery and to do a website where I tried to put a lot of different information about Elisabeth Freeman, and much of it is from the scrapbook. And it also inspired my cousin, Jane Van de Bogart, with Marguerite Kearns to do an exhibit also in Kingston, New York. So Elisabeth was born in Britain and came here as a child, but then returned a couple of times with her mother. And on one of those visits, she got involved with the Pankhursts, who were militant English suffragettes. And they were militant in the sense that they risked arrest and physical harm to present their grievances to Parliament. So they would go on these deputations and they would try to get their petitions to Parliament, and then inevitably they'd be arrested. So this slide is Miss Phillips getting out of jail, where she was forcibly fed, and and Pankhurst is on her right. And basically, they made a pageant or a demonstration every time they could do that. So they encouraged women to join them on a deputation, which was no small feat, because you pretty much were going to get roughed up by the police and arrested and then put in jail and so forth. They also did a lot of pageantry as media. So remember, there was not, radio or television. They had newspapers, and then they had in-person crowds. So this was a coronation march. So somebody was getting coronated, the Queen, I assume. And so they did a suffrage version of that and drew huge, huge crowds. And this was an international delegation. This is Elisabeth on the right. She was the organizer of the international delegations, and this is the French delegation. So pageantry was really a very big thing. So she was in England from 1905 to 1911, and then she came back to America. And she was a speaker and an organizer for suffrage and hired by suffrage organizations. And she was known as Militant, and she really traded on that reputation quite a bit. So she knew that would get press headlines. So in this article, Prepare to Do Battle, and she talks about how they used to go to the seashore, and if they were going to throw rocks or break windows, they would practice it with stones at the beach, which, was great copy. And that was her goal, is to get constantly in the media and to have supper time, this be the conversation. So she teamed up, this is her in her wagon and on the left is Rosalie Jones, who was an heiress and a fierce suffrage person. And so they, on several occasions, would get a wagon and go around the country and talk about suffrage. And they would go all over various places to spread the word, and they were hired to do that mostly. And this is a famous picture of her on a soapbox on a corner where she could just talk anywhere. She did platform speaking, regular lectures, but she also just would gather a crowd on a street corner and speak. So their most famous was the Pilgrim hike to Washington, D.C. in February of 1913. And basically they upstaged Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. And you can see from this slide that they got a lot of great coverage. They had embedded reporters, and every single day they would be in the New York papers, and then as they walked from New York to Washington, D.C. in February, they got into the newspaper. And she's third from the right in this picture. But you can see the whole trajectory of their trip. Now, this was a separate walk to Boston, and they were trying to promote the Women's Journal, which is the oldest feminist and suffrage paper in the country. And so that you can see from the wagon that they had, that they decorated it. And so everything was about media. Everything was about spreading the word, getting attention. They even had a hurdy-gurdy. So Elisabeth was really fearless. She was willing to do pretty much any stunt to get publicity for suffrage. So she would speak, anywhere that she was allowed, including like prize fights and car shows. And here she's posing with this bear, this small bear. And so she just really went anywhere and everywhere. This was an interesting point where she collaborated, or all these women collaborated with Thomas Edison to do one of the very first talkies. And the sound did not survive, but the film did. And she was one of the most natural and animated speakers, as you may see. When I look at this, it's very clear that Elisabeth didn't really know what this was all about. Of course, nobody did. This was one of the first talkies. But she's, kind of talking and looking at people and twisting around and very animated, as opposed to everyone else who's trying to be very serious. And I think it really captures who she is. So you'll notice that at least one of the speakers had a very formal way of, chopping her arm. And when Elisabeth comes, she's just very natural and very to the point. You can tell that she's nervous. And in the articles, which of course this was covered very thoroughly in the papers, that she said, there's no audience. I don't know how to speak to empty air. There's no audience. And so that was sort of difficult for her. I think she was a really great extemporaneous speaker and could bounce off the people in the audience. And of course, this film was shown in movie theaters as sort of like a, newsreel in the beginning of a feature film. And of course, it got booed and hissed and so forth in the movie. So I'm not sure it helped Thomas Edison any, but it was a great experiment, and she was right there. Whenever she could, she would take time from her suffrage work to support the Women's Trade Union League, which was the garment workers, and particularly when they went out on strike for higher wages and safer conditions, then she would join their picket lines and in some cases get arrested. And these were primarily Italian and Jewish immigrant workers. And so she would get in the newspaper because she was someone that got in the newspaper. And she would say, these police and hired henchmen were really awful, and the poor strikers are locked up in cells without a voice. And so she used her notoriety to champion the trade union workers. And then she would get arrested too. And of course they were released pretty quickly, but every time you get arrested, you get in the newspaper and you get their cause out there. So that was sort of her strategy all along, is to draw as much attention to the cause as possible. The Triangle Fire was in a factory, and what was common is that the owners of the factory would lock the doors to keep people from sneaking out or stealing this stuff. And so a fire broke out, and all these people were trapped in the fire. And some of them jumped, and some of them, just tried to get out. Many, many perished. And it was a very big cause at that time. There were protest meetings, and some good came of that. But Elisabeth was definitely one of the speakers at this particular meeting, and in general, protesting the treatment of garment workers. She also teamed up with Upton Sinclair, whom she clearly knew, because Rockefeller and the Standard Oil Company that he owned opened fire on miners in Colorado and their families and killed many of them. And it was really quite an outrage among labor organizers and labor supporters. So she got arrested with him on a couple of occasions, and they would do a silent vigil in front of Standard Oil to draw attention. In 1916, she was hired as an organizer in Texas. So she went down by train in Texas. And this little clip was a letter to her mother where she said, "Oh, guess who I ran into? Roy Nash, who's going down to Georgia to investigate where all those lynchings happened. Lynching of black people happened. And we had a nice chat, and he left the train this morning." So this chance encounter led to Roy Nash contacting her in Texas when there was a lynching in Waco. And she was very close to Waco at that time. And he said, "Won't you go get the facts for us?" The NAACP was a relatively new organization and mostly white. And they knew that the lynching issue was one that would get traction among black people, but also among whites, and really get the organization going. And so she did a full report, which they did almost word for word in a publication. And then she went on speaking tours all across the country, actually 2 different speaking tours, to raise money to publicize this lynching and to organize against it. So everywhere she went, there would be this picture of her, very sweet picture of her, and this horrific picture of this lynching. And she went, again, all over the country. So this is just one thing from her. July 16th, she did this, and you could just see that she just did a lot of organizing and reporting back to NAACP. So she basically gathered intel about the black communities all over the country and their ability to organize. This was one of the publications that they produced based on her information. So as soon as she got done with the anti-lynching campaign, she was contacted by Frances Keller, who later went on to be the first woman in FDR's cabinet. And she recruited Elisabeth to be part of the Hughes campaign train that went from New York to San Francisco and to LA and back in a big loop, campaigning for Charles Evans Hughes, who was opposing Woodrow Wilson. And he actually was favored in the race. He ultimately lost, as we know. But she was recruited to talk to black audiences, especially, in favor of Charles Evans Hughes and his more liberal, less Southern approaches, but also on suffrage and trade union. And she couldn't help herself. She would just speak on whatever issues she wanted to. But this is the very first time that women were used explicitly in a partisan election. So before that, it was like just about the vote. It wasn't about, oh, we favor this candidate over this or this party over this. So this was really kind of an important thing. And they were very famous people, intellectuals, rich people, wives of government officials, that sort of thing. So this is an article about her speaking. And again, she would get in the newspaper every single stop. And she would speak about anti-lynching, suffrage, labor. It says, in opening, she spoke a word for national suffrage, but was soon discussing Negro problems. And then she would sort of say stuff about Wilson and stuff about Hughes and the difference. And she said, in the South, the Negro is really disenfranchised, but I notice that in the North, the Democrats make a mighty high bid for the Negro vote. And Charles Evans Hughes was a Republican. This is a picture of her in Danville, Illinois. So when she had a stop there, she would get a picture imposed with the black community. So in 1917, I think she probably was not able to get hired as a suffrage speaker any longer because of her anti-lynching work. I don't know that for sure, but she got involved and was hired by the Emergency Peace Federation and then ultimately the People's Council for Democracy and Peace. And she was a lobbyist for them and a secretary, and she was charged with organizing a conference so that they could set up their organization. And they kept going from kind of pillar to post trying to get a meeting site, and kept getting frustrated by local officials saying, no, we don't want those cowards, those pacifists, those peaceniks, those sad-eyed doves is another way they called them. So again, the newspapers made a big deal about how she was this pacifist, but she fights like a demon. And that whole militant suffrage stuff that was her reputation. So this is where they actually sent troops to break up their little meeting, and it was a pretty little meeting. And they, in the press, they called them the sad-eyed doves. And in this case, whereas before the publicity, the media coverage was largely positive, and they was like plucky little English woman, that sort of descriptor. In this case, they were really seen as, traitors. There was a lot of war fury going on, and they were the sad-eyed doves, and, it was largely negative press. So after the war, the record goes a little bit cold in terms of newspaper publicity, in terms of the scrapbook. But she stayed active in different causes, and sometimes sort of left-leaning causes. And she eventually started an antique store in Provincetown for the summers. And then she moved to Pasadena, California. I think one of her benefactors gave her an apartment to live in. And in 1941, she died of pleurisy there. And this is the obit in the local Women's Party publication. This is a great description of who she was. Soapbox speaker, banner bearer, colorful organizer. Always the hardest work fell to her lot and was conquered by her enthusiasm. And I think that's actually quite true. I mean, she really had an incredible passion and enthusiasm and energy that she brought to various causes that she was involved in. And she was just fearless. I mean, there are other accounts, not in the scrapbook, but where she would jump up on a table and the police were at the front door and she would slip out the back, but she would give her speech first. And she just was irrepressible. She signed all of her letters, faithfully or faithfully yours, and then her initials EF.